What's up, gents? So today we're discussing the gaining phase. This is something that may not be applicable to all of you because most of you who join with me, it's usually on a 90-day fat loss program, though some of you are with me on gaining phases, or you're considering hopping on one now after completing your initial phase with me. So even if it's not applicable to you now, still worthwhile to go through the information because that might actually plant a seed of where you want to take things next. And it'll give you some stuff to think about. It'll also help close the loop on how a lot of the stuff works with body composition of losing fat mass, gaining muscle mass, etc. So what we're focused on here is building a bigger physique the right way, right? And the right way, as you will find out, is the right way that works for you because they're actually, despite popular opinion online, there is no one correct way to do a bulk, okay? We'll get into that. What is a gaining phase? Okay, a gaining phase, also called a bulk, is an intentional period of training and overfeeding to prompt muscle growth. So essentially, we're training more, usually in terms of volume, right? So the number of sets, reps, just the total amount of poundage lifted over a given session, week, over months, etc. Just with more mechanical tension placed on the muscle mass, also coupled with intentionally overfeeding a little bit to prompt muscle growth, okay? Most people can get away with gaining muscle mass and losing fat mass when they start training. But those newbie gains, as we call them, they're not so long-lived. Usually by the end of a 12-week program, maybe even 16 weeks, you've maxed it out, okay? And then you would really need to divide up your training between cutting and bulking to gain muscle mass or to lose body fat. So why do we want to gain muscle mass, right? Like imagine you started a program with me because you're someone who's just entered into their 30s, you want to lose a bit of body fat, you've heard that losing weight is beneficial for your overall health. Why would you want to go overfeeding and increasing your muscle mass? Well, there's actually a lot of health benefits that don't really get enough airtime when it comes to gaining muscle mass, okay? Specifically an increased metabolic rate. So literally just me sitting here, I'm burning more calories than the version of me 10 years ago who didn't have as much muscle mass, okay? And as we already know, or we should know at this point, caloric restriction or the balance of calories in and out is probably one of the most fundamental things you can do to avoid risks of various metabolic diseases like heart disease, diabetes, etc. Okay. We also have increased power output. Okay, so as we age, when we need to get up off the toilet, get up off a chair, I mean, these things sound trivial, but you have to remember there's a constant force being applied by gravity at all times. And as we age and we lose power, it happens in and around the 30s, 40s, around this. If we did nothing, we would progressively lose power every year, okay? So we actually want to increase our power output so that we can offset this and we can live much better quality years into the future where we don't have those kind of issues. We want increased strength. So strength is just overall a health benefit because it just helps you be resilient in a world that is trying to kill you in so many ways. Not to make things sound too negative. Also better mobility. Okay, so when we think of mobility, usually people think about flexibility, movement, and various mobility exercises. Well, they are dependent on two things. One set of muscles' ability to stretch, and then an opposing set of muscles' ability to mindfully contract. Okay, so like for example, if I want better mobility in my shoulder joint, yes, I would want to stretch the pectoral muscles. That could keep my shoulders rounded, but I also want to be strengthening the muscles in my rear delts, in my rhomboids, my mid traps, to help pull my posture back. Okay. Stronger bones. So as we increase muscle mass, bones actually need to become more structurally sound to house that muscle mass, to support it. Reduced neck and back pain. I know for myself, when I had a lot of issues with back pain when I was younger, I, like many other people, thought I needed to stretch more. So I started doing way more yoga. Okay, I actually trained to become a yoga instructor because I thought if I can just figure out this, I'll be able to heal my own body and etc. And my back pain actually only ended up getting worse. My neck ended up getting worse. And it wasn't until I started strength training, getting back in the gym, doing heavy deadlifts, squats, these kind of things. My back pain it's non-existent, okay? I get the odd flare up of sciatica if I squat like really wrong, you know. But for the most part, it's been a net benefit for me to do strength training when it comes to pain, okay? And a lot of people don't think about that. They always think about the risk associated with lifting heavy weights. If you do it correctly, there's a much higher risk, in my opinion, you're going to suffer some kind of chronic pain issue if you don't lift heavy weights. Improve self-esteem. You just carry yourself differently. You're walking better, your posture, your movement, everything is improved with more muscle mass, especially if you actually take up more physical space. It definitely has strong benefits, especially for men who, you know, if you go back to our ancestors' times, having physical prowess meant a lot, and that hasn't really changed in our biology, and then that feeds into our psychology, okay, and improved mental state, mental alertness, self-esteem, etc. And of course, increased sports performance, because both strength and muscle mass are not the same thing. They do benefit each other, okay? So if you have more muscle mass, more contractile muscle tissue, it is there's a good bet that you're going to be stronger, you're going to be quicker off the mark, you've got more type 2 muscle fibers, which are like fast twitch muscle fibers, making you more powerful, increasing your sports performance. Okay, so more muscle mass is a net benefit, whichever way you slice it, especially if you couple that with periods of losing body fat as well. So how do we initiate a gaining phase? I like to think of it as a 50-50 split between training and nutrition, okay? There's always that saying that 80% of gains happen in the kitchen, or abs are made in the kitchen. You'll hear all these kind of sayings. That only tells one side of the story. I think that tells the side of the story when you're cutting, right? I really do think that you could really reduce training volume, training intensity, and train very minimally when you're on a cut and preserve the vast majority of your muscle mass. But you'd have to be really, really dialed in and strict on caloric intake to make sure that your cut goes correctly, okay? That dial kind of shifts back to more of a 50-50 split when we're talking about a gaining phase. Your training is actually very important, and how you structure it, progressively overloading, it's really important. So it's more of a 50-50 split. And the good news for any of you who are transitioning from a cutting phase with me onto a gaining phase is that you're definitely going to have less mental bandwidth being sucked up by overthinking your diet, okay? It can be way more loose within certain parameters. And also then you save a lot of your thinking power for when you're actually in the gym, okay? How many calories? Now, this is like, how long is a piece of string? If you go onto the bulk or cut forum, for example, on Reddit, or if you go into comment sections of YouTube videos on these topics, you'll see people give concrete numbers, right? Oh, you just need a 200 calorie surplus, and that's all, right? Completely arbitrary. It depends on, a multitude of factors that we work out when we work together, okay? It depends on your lean muscle mass. It depends on how long have you been training, your age, everything. There's so many factors that will go into this, and it also depends on which type of bulk you want to pursue, right? So the way I tend to break it down is that a conservative or a lean bulk is your total daily energy expenditure plus just 5%. Now, you'll get a lot of the evidence-based lifters like Eric Helms, or even people who are less evidence-based, I'll put in brackets, also like Greg Doucette, popular YouTubers who will actually advocate for this approach, right? Which is what they call main gaining or lean bulking. There's a few different terms. I just like to think of it as a conservative bulk, right? It's your total energy expenditure plus 5%, very marginal, very playing it safe. The risk I actually see here, right? So it seems like a conservative or anti-risk approach. The risk, I think, is that you're wasting one of your most precious resources in life, which is time. Like, for me, I've found that just subjectively, that the more traditional route of specific bulk and cutting periods to be much more beneficial, and also kind of more mentally beneficial, because a lot of the times we don't see marginal progress, right? We don't see our hair grow. We don't see how we develop in many ways until we look back, right? Whereas we tend to feel things like acceleration, right? Moving at a fast pace, we feel that, right? And we get benefit, especially like if you're on a cutting phase and you drop, a few kilos in a month, right? You feel that sense of reward and it motivates you to keep going. So with bulking, I tend to more favor a moderate approach, which is your total daily energy expenditure plus 10%. I am completely fine that if I spend 6 months gaining and I gain 7 or 8 kilos, that I'm going to have to diet off like half of those kilos again anyway. I'm completely fine with that, and we'll see in a minute why that's actually a perfectly fine strategy. Then you've also got the aggressive or dirty bulk. Now, I don't advocate for dirty bulks at all, right? And in this picture, I use it to illustrate what a dirty bulk might look like, but in reality, I was actually moderately bulking just for a very long period of time. And that's why I had so much fat mass. But in reality, I never really advocate for that specific approach, okay? But it's just to know that that's what it is. If your rate of fat gain massively overtakes your ability to gain muscle mass, this can actually have detrimental effects on your hormones, on your ability to even partition nutrients. So for example, how insulin resistant you become, and you actually tend to just gain more and more fat mass as opposed to muscle mass. So you have to have some form of conservatism or pacing with a bulk just to keep hormones and insulin resistance and all these factors in check. But you don't, in my opinion, you don't need to go as conservative as a lot of the evidence-based community would lead you to believe. I think that looks fine on scientific studies, especially when you're isolating specific muscle groups, like you're doing cross-sectional studies of just a quadricep, right? But when we're talking about someone's overall physique and blending it in with their lifestyle and with wanting to see results, which is a perfectly fine human state of being, then I would much more favor a moderate approach when it comes to bulking of your total daily energy expenditure or your maintenance calories, adding on 10%. Okay, so looking at the considerations now of which approach you want to take, right? Whether it's the conservative approach, the moderate, or dare I say it, the dirty bulk approach, there are several factors that can actually play into this. So for example, if I have a young guy who is really lean, but he's also really skinny, can he get away with a dirty bulk? Actually, probably yes, especially if he's lifting enough, if he's recovering well. He's got a lot of newbie gains, right? So like imagine some young 19-year-old 60 kilo guy who has just started training. He'd probably get away with a dirty bulk and actually make very good use of those calories, okay? So I wouldn't be too concerned there. With someone who's still developing, to a certain extent, he's still growing, right? Especially if it's someone who's even maybe a bit younger again, like a teenager, that can actually be just fine and probably preferential in that scenario. Whereas if I've got someone who is in their 30s or their 40s and they're really looking to, minimize the amount of time wasted in, gaining excess body fat and having to diet it down again and start the process all over again, there's no way in hell I'm ever going to suggest that they do a dirty bulk, right? And if someone's even older again, it could actually have very negative consequences for their health in terms of, cholesterol, blood sugar, blood pressure, okay? So a moderate or actually even a conservative approach might make more sense in someone who's a bit older, okay? We also have genetic factors, right? So some people, no matter what they do calorie-wise or with their training, they will tend to gain body fat at certain levels, right? So like if someone is very prone to gaining fat mass, it makes no sense for me to give them a more moderate approach to bulking, especially if they're this kind of stocky build that naturally increases muscle mass, because they'd gain muscle mass regardless, even if I had them at maintenance or maintenance plus 5%. But all I'm doing then is layering on fat mass that they're going to have to lose later when dieting, okay? So a lot of these things play into the consideration. Also, like previous eating disorders, okay? If it's someone who has struggled with something like binge eating, for example, that may actually be a risk factor in getting them to do a bulk, or someone who's bulimic or previously or something like that, like because if they feel like they're gaining weight at too quick a rate, maybe that exacerbates a previous eating disorder that they thought they'd resolved, okay? So these things all play into those considerations. Beware of expert amnesia. I kind of referenced this lightly without being specific on it, but especially when it comes to people who are like the evidence-based lifters, right? So like these are guys who are doing bodybuilding shows and they're really into the weeds of this. And they've built their physique for like 20 years doing one thing, and then based on the literature, they're actually prescribing something else, right? Now, I'm not anti-science. I mean, the foundation of everything I teach you guys has a scientific background, but I think there's also a practice element, because science is always going to be lagging behind practice. So for example, much of what early bodybuilding would have taught people just from observation has come out to be true in scientific studies, which are published like 50, 60 years later. And also, by the same token, another load of stuff that bodybuilding would have prescribed has turned out to be complete garbage, right? So the science is going to be behind in certain areas, and it's going to give us strong indicators of what to do next in other areas, okay? And this is just a phenomenon I see occurring a lot, where you'll get guys who they did maybe a bit too much of an aggressive bulk initially. They learn from their mistakes. They did a more moderate approach. Maybe they did, but then they'll start prescribing very conservative bulking strategies from even to guys who are just young and starting out. And I think it's the complete wrong way to go. You actually need to play around, try these different strategies, see what works for you, see what the benefits are and what you didn't like, okay? I know personally for me, a moderate bulking strategy tends to work best, and also to keep it to about 12 to 16 weeks, because otherwise it turns into too long of a dieting phase, okay? And that's actually a pretty good standard for most people, assuming that you're starting it from a lean place and you want to be somewhat lean, that's your goal. If you actually don't care about being that lean, like you like sitting at like 20-ish%, you could extend your bulking much longer, okay? So the macros, people might wonder, how do I change my macros, if at all, when it comes to going from a cutting phase to a gaining phase? What I generally say is keep protein at a gram per pound of total body weight, right? So like when we're cutting, we probably do it of a gram per pound of lean muscle mass, just because as your calories go lower, it's difficult to make sure that you're eating enough protein. When you're bulking, it's going to be much easier to get those numbers, and also you want to benefit from the fact that you're in a prime muscle building phase, okay? So yeah, I'll go at a gram per pound of total body weight. Fat, we're going to keep that at about 20% of total calories. The reason I do this is that fat has a great role in keeping your hormones in check when we're training, when we're recovering, okay? But we don't want to go too high, and the reason being is because the margin for error is much less, right? Carbs have 4 calories per gram. So if you're saying, right, I'm going to greatly increase my carb intake, and let's say you get that a little bit wrong, there's a lot of margin, there's a lot of like slack there to make mistakes. With fat, if you start layering on butter, you're adding extra eggs, you're kind of being a bit more cutting loose with the oil servings, that can become a dirty bulk and a disaster really quickly without you even realizing it. Because imagine you've got all this built up pressure for when you might have been on a dieting phase and you're like, oh my God, I can't wait to be less restrictive with myself. Well, if you do that and it's mostly high fat foods, you can very quickly go way over on your calorie limit without realizing. So that's why I actually try and keep protein at about a gram per pound of total body weight. We keep fats moderate, okay? And then the balance we make up with carbohydrate. So before I move on to that point, carbohydrates have a phenomenal role as well in your overall performance in the gym. So as you start adding more carbohydrate, you'll find your performance in the gym skyrocket. And if the split is mostly carbohydrate in your gaining phase, you'll actually find that you're gaining weight at a much slower rate than you would have assumed, okay? Despite feeling so energetic, your muscles feeling very full of glycogen, and really ready to perform. So when do we increase calories on a gaining phase? Imagine you were on a diet to lose weight of 2,000 calories. Then you switch to a gaining phase and now you're eating 2,600 calories, for example. You are doing just fine, and then you see your weight start to stall, okay? When do you increase your caloric intake and by how much, without it seeming like, you're going to gain a bunch of weight? We want to hit a sweet spot where we're not waiting too long to do this, because then you could just be at maintenance calories and not actually be moving forward at all. And we also don't want to overshoot the mark where you're gaining a bunch of body fat that we'll have to diet off later, okay? So the question I would ask is, are you gaining between 1 to 2% of total body weight per month, okay? So imagine you're 80 kilos, and what you're looking for there is, after a month, you're at about an extra kilo, right? So I say between 1 and 2%, okay? So that would be 0.8 kilos to 1.6 kilos, somewhere in and around there per month. Now, you'll often hear online people saying like a kilo a month or a pound, I think it was a pound a week, some people say, or 0.5 pounds a week. It's very difficult when you're in a bulking phase to actually get this number exact, and you shouldn't aim to. What you should be looking at is the overall average, and is it between that 1 to 2% range, not if it's exact. You don't want to be trying to get exactly 1% or exactly 2%. Keep it within that range, and this is assuming you're on the middle of the road path for a moderate bulk. So if the answer is no, increase your caloric intake by either 5, 10 or 15% depending on the strategy you've opted for already, right? So if it's a conservative bulk, you're adding 5% of your total caloric intake. If it's the middle of the road, you're adding 10%, and if it's a dirty bulking phase, then you're adding 15%, which I don't advocate for, okay? But just to give you an idea of what that would be so you know how to avoid it. So then aim for the balance of, we've already discussed this, but every time you increase your caloric intake, try and get it to be mostly carbs. Now, it will be very difficult for you to have like an all carb source that gets you an extra 300 calories a day unless you're eating extra fruit or just honey or sugar or whatever. But try and make it mostly carbs. So like maybe it's a few extra pieces of bread. Maybe it's, a flapjack, right? Just these things that have mostly carbohydrate. Okay, so training. Progressive overload is key, but nearly everyone I see online gets this wrong about what progressive overload is. So a lot of people seem to think that progressive overload is going into the gym, and if you did 3 sets of 8 on the bench press at 60 kilos last week, that this week it has to be 3 sets of 8 at 62.5 kilos or 65 kilos or whatever, right? That you're always increasing the weight. I think this is because the word overload seems to have a connotation with load, as in the load that you lift. This is not the case, right? When we talk about progressive overload, specifically when it comes to training for additional muscle mass, we're talking about increasing one of the variables that constitutes volume, at least one variable. It can be multiple, or it can just be one. So when we talk about overall volume, we're talking about sets, reps, the load lifted, time under tension, and usually at an intensity of like 1 to 2 reps shy of failure, okay, or at failure, but at least an RPE of 8 or reps in reserve of 2, okay, that level of intensity, and increasing at least one variable. So maybe you're in the gym and you do that bench press of 60 kilos, 3 sets of 8, and maybe the next time you do 3 sets of 9. Maybe the time after that you do a set of 10, a set of 10, and a set of 9. And maybe the time after that, you're only adding 1 rep, right? And then when you get to 3 sets of 12, you're increasing the weight, right? That's what progressive overload is. Now, it can be much more aggressive in the beginning. So when you start training, especially like for the first 8 to 12 weeks, you're looking to like increase the weight progressively, and you can move up really, really quickly. Then as you start to plateau a little bit, you are looking for very marginal gains. What I like to do for most clients, especially if it's gaining muscle mass, we're looking for two repetitions spread across 3 sets. So let's pick an example here. You've got 100 kilos on the leg press. In the beginning, you're able to add 5 kilos, 5 kilos, 5 kilos, and maybe you get to a point where you're lifting 120 kilos, and then you're just looking for 2 repetitions. So it goes from 3 sets of 8 to 2 sets of 9 and a set of 8, or then maybe 3 sets of 10. You're slowly increasing, and I like to do it with just 2 repetitions spread across 3 sets. For most people, that seems to be good after they've done that initial phase of 8 to 12 weeks of newbie gains. The definition here of what we're looking for in terms of progressive overload. So an increase in the total number of load, reps, sets, and the frequency of training per week. It can also be in terms of time under tension. So imagine you had all these variables the same, but you were doing slower negatives on every repetition. That would also be a way of progressively overloading. Be mindful of the stimulus to fatigue ratio, okay? You can get much stronger in a bulk, absolutely. By lifting heavier weights, you're eating more calories than your body needs, but you don't have to focus exclusively on this method of overloading to gain muscle mass, right? So you don't need to lift heavier weights every single time, as we've just discussed. Getting stronger will increase your muscle mass over time, for sure, as will increasing muscle mass will increase your strength over time, for sure. But they're both different aims, right? So like if you increase your strength by X amount, the amount of muscle mass you're going to gain is probably going to be a little bit less, but you've still made a net gain, okay? If your focus is on strength, right? Like so very intense sets, low repetitions, etc. Whereas if we were doing more of a bodybuilder style training split of we're training 5 to 6 times a week, it's much higher repetitions, lower rest times, you're going to gain a bigger proportion of muscle mass and and less strength compared to if you were doing a strength training program. So what we'd be looking for is something like a phased approach. So for example, if I'm on a bulking phase, and let's imagine I want to split that up into 3 6-week blocks. So maybe an 18-week gaining phase in total, spanning the winter. Block 1, I'm going to focus more so on increasing the total amount of kilos lifted. So this is going to give a very high fatigue to stimulus ratio. It's going to be mostly compound lifts, and the rep ranges I'm going to be using are like 4 to 6 reps at the low end, 6 to 10, 8 to 12, because this is like a strength and muscle mass hybrid. It's definitely not a powerlifting phase or a pure strength training program. But this might be my beginning block to just build a good foundation of strength that's going to set me up to lift heavier weights as I progress through the rest of the training blocks. In block 2, I'm probably going to increase the number of repetitions that I'm doing. I'm going to start to balance out the load and volume distribution, right? So I might level off a little bit in how I'm increasing the weight, but begin to add more sets, more reps. A much more balanced view of stimulus to fatigue, more balanced exercise selection. So adding in more isolation lifts here as well. Then coming into block 3, I'm going to look for higher volume, high stimulus, low fatigue exercises, less complex lifts that don't take a whole lot of time to learn. And I'm going to go for much higher rep ranges, something around 8 to 20 reps on each exercise. Okay, so we've discussed about how to bulk, how to set it up. Now, your plans very rarely align with how you've laid things out and how things are going. We need to adapt on the fly. That's why you guys pay for coaching with me. It's why we do monthly review calls, check-ins, etc. Because life happens, okay? So if we were to just look at, if we had our 12 to 16 week plan, but let's imagine we also wanted to kind of self-regulate and say, okay, when do I stop a gaining phase? Now you can see in this picture here, I am definitely above 20% body fat. Like this is taken under perfect lighting after a pump in the gym, and I'm still pretty fat, right? So that was definitely a sure time where I needed to stop bulking, but I just loved the process. Honestly, my energy was amazing. Testosterone was through the roof. I just felt great, except for my confidence around what I was wearing or how my clothes fit. If I took that image part away from it, like I actually felt amazing. But when you know you need to stop is basically when you start seeing things like maybe it's stretch marks, maybe it's, you don't fit into certain clothes, maybe the amount of food you're eating is no longer sustainable. It could be just personal body fat standards, which was the case for me. I had just too much love handle and too much belly going on. It can be to do with your goals. So one of the reasons I actually kept this gaining phase going so long was because I knew I wanted a certain amount of muscle mass coming into my 30s, okay? And another indicator to stop could be if your blood pressure starts going a little bit high. If you've done your blood work and your blood glucose or your cholesterol is a bit out of whack. We do not want to risk your long-term health for the sake of trying to see out a bulk. You know what I mean? So definitely be responsible when determining how long to keep a gaining phase going. And you can offset a lot of the risks by periodically just doing a little bit of cutting to clean up, okay? Bringing things back into balance, getting your body composition under control before you start another gaining phase to maybe gain the rest of the muscle mass that you actually want to have in your long-term goal. And this is a continual process, right? You'll do a gaining phase and then you'll decide, okay, I'll do a bit of dieting, I'll do some gaining, do some dieting, and then eventually you're at a leaner body composition. What these numbers indicate here under each one of these rectangles is the split of muscle mass and fat mass that's affected every time you go through these phases. So for example, when you're on a gaining phase, it's usually like 50-50 between, you're gaining 50% muscle mass and 50% fat mass if you've done it correctly. And if you're definitely gaining kilos, okay? This is a fine trade-off, by the way. This is not a bulk done incorrectly. This is how to bulk, okay? Though that approach has been kind of demonized in recent years, there's the body just grows all together, right? So bone mass, fat mass, muscle mass, it grows in one direction, okay? But when you diet down, as you see in the numbers here, we're losing maybe 10% of our gains in muscle mass, but then we're losing 90% of the fat mass we've put on, rather. So like you're left with a net gain. You're retaining the vast majority of your muscle mass that you've built previously, and then you're cutting off the fat mass. Then a few weeks into your next gaining phase, you've rebuilt all that muscle mass anyway of the marginal amount that you may have lost in your previous dieting phase. And when you continue to repeat this process of 2 steps forward, 1 step back, that's how you actually get to your goal physique. And even when you reach there, you'll probably want to do something else. Guys, I hope that's given you a comprehensive view of bulking. It's definitely not the extent to everything we could discuss on that matter. So if you do have any questions, please let me know. Would be happy to chat through them, and we can take things from there.